This is one of those videos that I know is not going to probably be the best received by people who are fans of this series, of which there are a lot, but I always debate when I read something really popular and I don't care for it on whether I should make a video or not, but I have a lot to say here, and so we're going to still talk about it. If you're a big fan of the series and you disagree with me, that's totally okay, but I'm going to talk about all the reasons why I'm not going to be continuing the series and why the first two books have just not really worked for me. Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video, we're going to be talking about Suneater in general. Specifically, I just finished reading Howling Dark. I did do a full review on Empire of Silence if you want more there, so I will talk about some of those elements, but this is more talking about what's been done with the first two books, and is going to be a little bit more specific to Howling Dark because of the fact that that's the one that I just finished, and like I said, I've already talked about Empire of Silence. And in my review of Empire of Silence, because I was sort of middling on it, I ended up going with about 3.5 because I had some issues with things that were going on, and that's something that I had been told a lot of people do. Like the first book not being the strongest, everybody kept telling me book 2 is where it really picks up, book 2 is where it's really going to hook you. Fortunately, that was not the case. I felt my issues really continued and in some cases got worse. But I feel like there's a lot of things here, and I get why the series works for people. Some of the reasons why it doesn't work for me, I think, are some of the things people probably like. But it's also something I want to talk about a little bit more detail. So with the first book and continuing on, I had some issues with the way that it was paced. It felt like it was kind of an interesting start, and then it jumped around a lot within the book, and then we had kind of a really long and what seemed a little bit drawn out in the middle section, especially like the Colosso parts, which I know is pretty common. Not everybody's a fan of that there. Then by the end, we had some things that were the draws for me. There's hints that we might be looking at like this ancient alien civilization. We get some hints of actually seeing the Yalson, which are like the big bad aliens that we have. We get some hints of that kind of thing, and also it seems like it's going to set some things up. And then book 2, very famously, has a very jarring start and doesn't kind of do exactly what it seemed like it's going to do. And for me, the pacing issues kind of continued, where it was something really similar in book 2, where we have the start. It's a little bit jarring, but then we're getting ready to go do some stuff, and it felt like the middle we just took a really long time in the middle, kind of meandering, and then there was a lot more action and sort of draw at the end, and it reminds me of, which I never watched the show, so if this doesn't make sense, then it's fine, but it reminds me of a lot of things that I've heard with The Walking Dead, where like it starts really interesting, and it drags most of the season, and then there'd be some big draw that would make people want to come back. That doesn't work for me. That's why I never watched that show. Like, the pilot was excellent, and I'd seen there was some other bits and pieces of it that were good, but so much of it just sort of dragged and felt meandering. And that ended up being my biggest complaint here, is the meandering is extreme. Now, I did do a live chat about the first book, and on that it was mentioned that apparently Christoher Ruocchio did not do an outline for the first book and was kind of forced to by the publisher have some form of outline, but is more of a discovery writer and just trying to explore. And there's nothing wrong with doing that route, but I feel like it comes through as him not always knowing where he's going with something, because there are just, in both books, I felt there were extended periods where it just feels like we're not really moving forward. We're just spinning the wheels. We're having the main character, Hadrian, just talk and talk and talk and talk about something. Or we just have these sequences, these scenes, these chapters, these sections. They seem like they go on way too long and seem like they're just aimlessly kind of wandering around. And then very suddenly, the author realizes, oh shoot, I need to move the plot forward, and so we just move the plot forward. And it doesn't always make sense why or how. And it's something I have seen other authors do this, including authors that I've like to work a little bit more. It's a complaint I've seen some people make about Hobb in some cases, although that worked a little bit better. We'll talk a little bit there with the comparisons a little bit later. But so it's something that, not everyone's going to have an issue with. But for me, I struggled because I just wasn't super engaged. And then by the time you get to the big things that are more interesting or that there's a lot going on, I'm just already not very engaged. And so it doesn't really pull me in and keep me going because I've had so much trouble there. So that with pacing wise, I feel like I struggle. I don't feel like these books probably need to be as long as they are, especially because we tend to have slow middles in each one. That is still going to be kind of a subjective thing. Now, I also understand too, this is coming from me. I am like the king of enjoying these slower stories and like loving a series that people are like, oh, this is too slow. I am the one who will call something fast paced and have other people be like, what are you talking about? This is super, super slow. So I feel like the way people respond to pacing is very subjective as well. But for me, these books did feel slower paced, and it wasn't even always necessarily that it was slow paced. It just was inconsistent pacing. There were some times that seemed to be really dragging and slow, and other times that we seemed to just move directly past something and just skip over and go from there. I do know I've heard that time jumps are really common here, and time jumps are a thing that, again, they can work really well or they cannot work as well. And here I feel like it didn't work as well for me because it tends to make it feel like we're skipping over potentially important or more interesting things than what we're actually spending time on in the book, which is usually not a good sign for me. If I'm like, I'm much more interested in what apparently happened while we weren't here than what's happening on screen. But also it makes it feel that I have to be told things more than being shown them. And that happens with some of the relationships in the book, where I'm told these relationships exist, or I'm told this is how people feel about each other, or that these people are really close, but I don't really see it. I haven't been shown it. And when we're actually on page, it doesn't come across very well for me. And I think that's also something that is definitely a critique and an issue I had here with the series. I feel like this is almost all telling and not showing. There's very little showing here. Now, again, not everybody cares about that, but that's something that tends to just not work as well for me. I really like to be shown things, and that can be harder to do with a first-person narration as well, especially this is sort of, the basis of this is Hadrian kind of giving his memoir, his account of his life and what's happened. And so naturally, there's going to be narrating and telling, but also I feel like there's very, very little of things that we're shown. We're just always told. It's just Hadrian telling us what's happening. And I think you can do that in a better way. That can work a little bit better for sure. And here it just didn't land as well for me. Now, the other thing too, I will note is just that, and I know how this is going to come across. I'm not going to like super, super harp on this, but as I noted in my review, and as I know many people have pointed out, Ruocchio uses a ton of elements from other sci-fi series and other stuff like that. It's really specifically brought up with Dune. I've seen people like go really hard with that, but the first book in a lot of ways felt very derivative because there's so much that's inspired by or borrowed from other series, other books, and that did not get any better for me in book 2. I just felt like, in the nicest way, it doesn't feel like there's a lot of originality here, and it doesn't feel like Ruocchio has that much original to say. I know that sounds harsh, and it's probably going to be the part that's going to really tick people off and maybe make you rage quit this video. I'm not attacking Ruocchio. I'm not saying that he's plagiarizing, ripping off. I think, honestly, this is one of those things, too, that I've noticed really doesn't work for me, but I've seen other authors, including very popular authors or who are really well-loved work, where people like to just see familiar tropes. They like to see familiar tropes, familiar ideas done in a different way. And that's a preference. I think that's one of the reasons why, some people, they want to find the thing that's just like their favorite thing. And I was talking to people about this, and I think it makes sense. And I'm not saying that you're wrong if you like this. It's just, for me, I kept feeling like I'm just seeing these same things, and I like a different spin on things. I like more like, here's something you haven't seen, or here's this explored in a very different way. That's something that is, for me, a really positive thing, and it becomes a negative thing for me when it's not done that way. And again, is my kind of preference. But Dune is the big one that's mentioned, like the Litany on Fear, which is repurposed and changed a little bit, but there are so many references to other things, just ideas. I made the joke, you have your legally distinct lightsabers, which are just absolutely lightsabers. They have phasers, and they call them, phase disruptors, which is just a longer name. But I mean, I roll my eyes a little bit every time I hear them set their phasers to stun. Later on as well, there's mention that they have adamant, which is like this unbreakable metal that's really way better. And I'm like, yeah, okay, adamantium, yeah, we have the thing. And so a lot of it, I feel like it's just, there's not a lot of changes. It's really, really noticeable that it's here. But then there's references to movies, shows, books. Like there's a Firefly reference in book 1. There's an Indiana Jones line in book 2. There's just things like that. And I feel like it depends on the kind of story that you're telling and that you're trying to tell, how much I'm willing to put up with that. Now, I feel like the more you lean into comedy, or of course, if you're actually doing like a satire on the stuff, it makes sense to see those familiar elements and having kind of the jokes, the lines, the references. I feel like that work if you're going for a lighter tone. But for me, it feels like the book is supposed to have a very, very serious tone. This is supposed to be a very serious story. It's supposed to be this big, epic space opera. There's a lot of fantasy elements in there as well. But so the tone and what it feels like the author is going for clashes for me personally with the level of referential like jokes, humors, lines, and elements that I've seen before. And there's I can't go into a ton of details without spoiling, but there's also a ton of stuff that feels very lifted from Stargate, almost exactly. And then I've seen other people mention too, there are times where he is actually taken lines, changed the wording around a little bit, and used some things that are very similar from other books. There's also a lot of times it's just usually if there's like a really good quote or like line or something that sounds really pithy and really nice, it also always just sounds a little bit familiar. There's not a lot of lines that are just like, this is a really unique line or a really unique viewpoint. It's just like ideas that you're familiar with or may have read before. And so for me, it's just, even though I'm not super well read in sci-fi, and I'm not even the most like well watched with sci-fi movies and TV shows, even I was just finding constant things that reminded me of other things. And that is not always a bad thing. Like, it's cool to be like, oh, this is sort of like, and I mean, it's a marketing tool too. Like I said, some people be like, oh, this is like, Firefly, but this, or this is like Star Wars, but this, or, you see that with fantasy as well. It's Lord of the Rings meets this, or it's Game of Thrones meets this. It's a really common tool to get you into something. But for me, I just constantly, every big thing felt like something else to me, and it just really kind of pulls me out because I feel like I'm not seeing new, original, exciting things, and the flashes of the new, original, exciting things I just don't feel like we focus on nearly as much. Some of the choices that are made story-wise, or the tropes too that happen, it seems almost like Ruocchio likes to tease you with something that seems really good or interesting and then just pull the rug out from you. It's happened in both books where it'll be like, oh, this is what could have happened. And I'm like, yeah, that sounds really interesting, but that's not what happened. What instead happened is something much less interesting. And I feel like to some degree that has to be intentional. But again, when you're giving me two options and you're always picking the one that is less interesting to me and not showing me the one that's more interesting to me, it's hard for me to really feel engaged in a book and really care and feel the weight. Now, I feel like I should also talk a little bit about characters, because I don't hate Hadrian. I made some jokes too and there are lots of like in-jokes in the book too, where it is pointed out that Hadrian is very melodramatic. He's very melodramatic. He likes to wax poetic a lot and talk about and philosophize about different things and do that type of stuff. And again, I think that can work. I think there were some good passages and examples of that in the first book, but it just gets to the point where I feel like, again, we're spending a lot of time. And there was some especially long sequences where Hadrian's going on monologues about this or that, the other thing in book 2 that just started to really wear on me a bit. But also, I feel like there's a lot of repetition with those bits in the narration, which I feel like doesn't make sense in the story. In the first book, I made the joke, if the Office gif, shut up about the sun, because there's so many times, and the series is called Suneater, so there's something there, but there's so many references to him destroying a sun just constantly. It's this thing that's going to happen later that's really important. Obviously, it's what we're named after, but there were so many references to it, and I'm just like, yeah, I get it. And in this one, there's just constant references to one of the references he's making to classical Earth literature. He just makes the same reference again and again and again. And there's some other lines, other descriptions, other things that just are repeated over and over. And again, I feel like it's because so much of this is telling, not showing. So instead of showing us these things, it seems like the author feels they need to keep telling you so that you know what's going on. And there was a really big thing. It's supposed to be this super emotionally charged moment between characters and with what happens with these characters, but I didn't really feel like it was earned. I didn't feel like it felt realistic to me, because I've just only been ever told that these characters have the relationship they do, and it didn't make sense. I'm being very vague to avoid spoilers, but to me, I'm just like, it did nothing for me, because I'm like, okay, yeah, I understand that I'm supposed to feel that this is a big deal, but because I've just been told the characters have the type of relationship that they do, the interaction just ended up being really underwhelming for me. There's also a really large kind of reveal in the middle of book 2, which I think that's the thing that is supposed to be what really drew me in. But again, it just kind of, instead of doing something more interesting, it just kind of like, yeah, we're going to reveal that, oh, this is just another kind of basic trope, more of a fantasy trope than a sci-fi trope, but it just reveals that this is all a basic trope. And it made sense. I saw coming to an extent based on some other things that had happened. It fills into blanks, but it just, it was really, again, underwhelming for me. I was expecting maybe we're going to do something really cool and really different, and then it just didn't really land for me. And so that's also just something that I had issues with. Now, I reference the Earth literature type of thing, because this is something that is far from just an issue with this series, but this is one where it does a lot of it. I always feel like if you're going to do the references to philosophy or texts or anything, especially with this story, which is taking place tens of thousands of years after the Earth of now, this is like a far future type of thing, is why is there nothing but the super, like the ancient Earth type stuff? That's all. We're going to talk about these philosophers that were in some cases ancient for us today, but you have all of this that still exists, but there's no philosophy that's from another time afterwards. And maybe this gets explained here later. It's like I said, a lot of authors do it. It's just easier than writing your own philosophy bits. I totally get that. I don't even hate on that. I've seen lots of authors. I've seen authors joke that like all of this is these, and that's what it is. And you can tie that in, but it seems like that's such a recurring theme. And so it ends up just making it feel almost like it's the author just being like, look how smart I am. Look at all of these references and quotes I'm familiar with and can use. And there are literal times where it's just characters going back and forth, having a quote off about who knows the most obscure stuff like this. And it's something that instead of using that to have new philosophies, new types of things, especially because we've set up this whole new religion, philosophy, rules and everything, but so much we're still just talking about there. And I feel like that's something, it's just, you have so much opportunity to do different stuff in fantasy or in sci-fi, especially when it's super in the future, that I like it when authors, and again, personal preference, but I like it when authors have their own writings or have their own references or allusions to this or that. And yeah, they can be based on something or they can be an entire creation, but just changing it up a little bit, I feel like for me would have been more rewarding. There are definitely some references where like, there's a reference to something from like super old Earth that's not quite right, and you can recognize some, and I'm sure there are others that I missed because I don't think I'm nearly as well versed in a lot of the stuff as Ruocchio. It clearly is, but there's some references there, and so I think that's kind of a clever thing where like you realize like, oh, this changed over time, but there's also so much of it that really hasn't changed over time either, and I also just question that as well with really none of this has changed, but then there's enough nuggets that have. But again, that's just more of a personal preference, especially with that being such a integral part of the storytelling. It's something that I just would have liked to have a little bit more variety to, or more changes to, instead of just pulling from the real quotes. Now, I do want to jump back a little bit to the some of my talks about how the plot moves forward and some things feeling kind of forced, as well as tropes, and then we're going to get into comparisons, and I will certainly acknowledge that a little bit too. But tying some of those things together too. So I commented, it feels like often the plot's just meandering, and you then have the force to just jump forward. And I mentioned Hob too, because I've heard people kind of complain that Hob tends to do that type of thing. But I feel like also it sometimes feels like it's just the author that wants to do specific things, and so sometimes things either feel shoehorned in or they feel like they kind of happen out of nowhere. That was a complaint when I read the Lesser Devil, the novella that's like between 1 and 2, I guess. It felt like none of that really made sense to me in the world. It just felt like that was the kind of story the author wanted to tell, and so he just kind of shoehorned the characters into it. There are definitely some things like that that I think in both books 1 and 2, where it's like, does it necessarily make sense that these types of elements or these things happening this way exist? Not necessarily, but it seems like that's just the story that the author wanted to tell. And granted, authors should absolutely tell the story that they want to tell. I'm a big proponent of that, so I'm not ever going to knock an author for doing that. But also, for me, if it feels like you're just trying to put elements in that you want to tell, but they don't necessarily fit, that's also something that's just not usually going to work for me preference-wise. I think it's great to tell the type of story that you want to tell, but sometimes when it feels like it just clashes or things come out of nowhere, I do have an issue with that. Now, getting into the comparisons, because I know there are a lot of people that compare this to Red Rising. Now, granted, I hated that series. I only read the first 2 books, and the second book I feel like was never going to win me over because of how much I disliked the first one. So I'm not really going to talk about that because I am not somebody who's super familiar with all the stuff that is done. I do feel like the character work, despite me really disliking the main character especially, I do feel like the character work was probably a little bit better in that one, to be honest. And they were much shorter, but the style is really different. What it's doing is really different, so I don't know that it's a really great comparison anyway. I think partially just because that's also a first-person narration, and naturally being the fantasy reader, my first-person narration in that style, I think of Hobb and the Fitz books, where it is also an older main character who is telling the story and will have his bits of philosophizing. But I feel like the writing and the character work there are so much stronger for me in the Hobb books. Although, funnily enough, my controversial take, I hated the last trilogy, and I feel like things that happened in the last trilogy really similar in not in the actual events, but in my complaints are very similar in the last Fitz and the Fool trilogy. As they are here, where things just seem to feel forced and happen, and we just meander sometimes way too much and things like that. So I actually have really similar complaints, which I find kind of funny since in my head I keep comparing them. But at least looking at like the first 2 trilogies, they don't compare super well. Now, I did also happen to be reading R. Scott Baker, The Warrior Prophet, at the same time I was doing this, and it didn't stack up the best there too, because Baker is a phenomenal author and very, very different in style, but also there's a lot of philosophy in there. There's a lot of quotes and that type of thing. So that was also a book that was much more to my preference where we're doing that, but it always feels like it has a point. It's going somewhere, and it's not just the exact same things from our Earth. It's, adapted from real things, which is also more to my preference. So those are some things that I will certainly mention there. But most of the things that come to mind for comparisons, again, are things that it feels like are being taken from a bit too liberally for me. Dune being the really big one, and especially with, instead of fear is the mind killer, fear is a poison is the thing, which doesn't sound nearly as cool, just for one, but it's also repeated like a lot. And I feel like if you're going to take such an iconic thing and also have a lot of similarities that are very clear from that, changing it up a bit more or not having that be the focus, maybe having the line in there as a nod but not constantly using it, I would have been more to my preference. But I mean, we have that. We have the shields from Dune, which are 1000% the shields for Dune. They have them for the exact same reasons. Book 2 even explains the same basic explanation that was done in Dune as to why they still have them and why they, swords are still a thing as well. So it's again, just taking that. I mentioned there was like a Firefly reference, but there's less probably from Firefly overall. But then we also have lots of stuff that feels Stargate. The Cielson feel very much like the Wraith from Stargate to me. There are some details that come later that I want to talk about as well that make that even more. But then some serious plot points, some like really serious plot points in book 2 feel very, very much like they're from Stargate. Between SG-1 and Atlantis, kind of a mix. But again, things that really feel from there. And also just there's a lot of different tropes and other things that I've seen. And I mentioned some of the specific words, terms, things that are taken, but it just feels like a lot of this feels really, really familiar. There's a whole bit, especially in book 2, that's, a play on like looking for the, whether you want to call it the lost city of Atlantis or the Fountain of Youth or Treasure Island, that idea. It's been in storytelling for a really, really long time, obviously, about going and looking for this kind of mystical place. So again, something that's done, and there were some elements there as well that just I felt like they were things that I had seen before, and in some cases they were. There's a scene in book 2 that involves waiting for somebody to call you to be seen in an audience, and it's a trope that's been used quite a lot. I literally, like 2 weeks before reading this, read another book that used the exact same thing. although it was shorter and didn't dwell on it super long. But again, it's okay to use similar elements. Tropes exist for a reason. People like seeing them, but I felt like this always was too much of that. It's too much just tropes I've seen before, concepts, ideas I've seen before, actual physical things I've seen before, and it just did not branch into anything that was different enough or engaging enough for me to really care, quite honestly. I found myself it felt like a chore to get through Howling Dark, and I kept just waiting, thinking like, I'm almost halfway. Any moment I'm going to get to the big thing, and then I got to the big thing, I was very underwhelmed. I will say the end of Howling Dark, again, was rather strong in some ways. I think, again, there's something that the much more interesting thing is presented, and then the rug's pulled out, and then it ends up doing something much less interesting, in my opinion, at the end of it. But like, there's action, there's a lot of like questions being answered, but also more questions being arisen. And I feel like the ending of book 2 is really strong. But again, it's still doing a lot of the things that have me less interested. And the one thing that I'm like, that's actually kind of cool, I'd be interested to see. No, we're not actually going to do that at all. We're going to do something totally different. And I won't be continuing this series. So I know this has been a bit long-winded. Again, if you've made it this far, I hopefully, I imagine that the more angry comments are going to be people who didn't make it this far. But if you've made it this far, I'm not saying this is a bad book. I'm not saying you shouldn't read this. I'm not saying you're wrong if you like this. I'm just kind of explaining for me all of the issues that I had with it. I feel like it's a valuable exercise to just talk about what works and doesn't work for people with different books. Hopefully, since I've really tried so hard to keep this spoiler free and just talking about some concepts, hopefully, maybe this is helpful with seeing if this is the kind of thing that even though I didn't like it, you're immediately like, ooh, that actually does sound like something I would like. I'd love to see all that stuff together. Maybe it'll work for you. And if you're a person who maybe is going to have the same thoughts as me, and you think like, oh yeah, this sounds like, well, then you won't read something and end up not liking it there. So I always think it's valuable to discuss and dissect. And again, I can understand too why a lot of people like this. There's a lot of elements, and if that's the kind of stuff that you like, there's a lot of that in fantasy, and there has been for a long time too, where it's repackaging a familiar story in a different way or using a lot of familiar elements, references. It's pretty normal, but it's just for me that's not really what I look for, and it just this series is leaning a bit too far there. And even if it does more later on, I'm sure there's going to be some people like, oh yeah, but we really do get more later on that is more unique, more different. I'm just at this point, I've not been pulled in enough from these first 2 books. I know the other books are also long, and the style is just not really working for me. Hopefully it will more for other people, and I'm glad that other people are enjoying this, but it's ultimately not going to be one that's for me. And yeah, those really are my thoughts on Suneater, Empire Silence, Howling Dark, the first 2 books that I have read. I would love to hear from you. Like I said, agree or disagree. Love to hear from you, your thoughts on any of the stuff that I said. If you had a similar experience, if you had a totally different experience, or if there are certain things that you saw completely differently, always interested to hear from you. So definitely let me know in the comments. Make sure to give the video a like if you enjoyed it. Check the links in the description as always for the Patreon if you want to support what I do, as well as the Wizard of the Enclave Discord if you want to chat books, whether this book, other books, really anything at all. It's a lot of fun. We'd love to have you. And of course, if you enjoy my content, make sure to subscribe.